So we're going to add a text layer. I'll bring this in after I do my little star shapes. So we'll move over to 4 seconds. And we'll add some text in and just animate it onto the screen. So I'll take the type tool. And I'm going to make an area that matches the size of my window, at least horizontally. And so we can look at some of the different options for how we can align the text. And then I'm just going to type something, and then I'll change the style. So I'll do like a title for my animation. So I'm making an animation about an astronaut cat. And it's very hard to see because the default is very small. And so I need to select this text. I need to either change the style first and then type, or if I've already typed, I need to make sure to select all this text, because if I start changing the style, it won't affect the existing text unless it's already selected. Ralphie, remember what I said about being chill while I'm doing demo? Thank you. Okay, so we've got the text selected. So over here in this right menu, as I mentioned before, we haven't really used this much yet, but the things that we'll see over here are going to change depending on what tool we have selected or what window we're using. And so since we have the text tool selected, we see our text options here. So I'm going to change the font first, and I'll just use my font drop down, and we see some cool different options. Maybe I'll go with this interesting script font. Then we have the size, so we'll make this a little bit bigger. I probably don't want to make it the full size of the window, but notice that when we get to that size, it starts to break to the next line. And then eventually, if this window isn't big enough, it'll get cut off. So that's why we want to have a nice large area to work with. And I'll make this a little smaller. We can change the fill. So maybe I'll make it a little darker. Something like that might be nice. I can select out of here, so I'll hit escape so I can see what that looks like. And then I'll hit the type tool again so I can select it. I can also add a stroke, but I'm not going to do that now. And then I also have these paragraph options, so I can center it, and I can do other things if I have like paragraph, like I can justify the text, or although I wouldn't really want to do that here. So I'm going to center it, and then I can also align to the middle like that using the align properties. So I can kind of get my text into the middle of the screen if I want to. I might change this in a second when I animate it, but for now I'll kind of leave that there. And so there I have my title for my animation. And so now I can just animate this onto screen. And text works the same way as any of our other layers. So I can animate the opacity. If I want to fade it in, I could animate the position or the scale. Anything that I can do with my other shape layers, I can do with this text layer. So let's animate our text into the scene. So I'm going to get my selection tool and grab this layer, and I'm going to use the position. So I'm actually, the position right now, I want to center the text first. I guess it's centered. The position of this is not really centered, but that's okay. So I'll just, I'll make a keyframe here, but then I'll move it over. And then I can move the text up here. And if I hold shift, it'll keep the line straight up and down. And so now we can have our text come onto the screen. I might need to, okay, there we go. And so there we go. We can have our text appear on screen. If we want to move it off screen, we can animate it in a different way. But basically, text works like any other layer that you might want to add onto the screen. So let's use this layer. A couple things I want to cover real quick before we go to talk about keyframe interpolation. So I'm going to move this down a little bit and just focus on this one area. When I'm animating stuff, I haven't really been doing this so far, but when I'm actually working in After Effects, I'll be using key shortcuts a lot more than I will be actually using the mouse to open my different properties. And so there's key shortcuts that are related to all the different properties. And so if I want to animate the position, I'll usually hit B or P to open position. Or if I want to animate opacity, that's T. I guess for transparency, I don't know why it's not O. If I want to do rotation, I hit R. Notice that that property is changing. And then if I want it to go away, I just hit R again. So this makes it a lot easier to animate or keyframe a specific property and not have to open all of the other properties at the same time. Okay, so let's look at some different things we can do with our text animation that we just added. So we have our text moving into the scene very sort of leisurely. I'm going to expand this a little bit so we can see it kind of sit in place. So with our default keyframes, this is what's called a linear interpolation. And what linear interpolation means is that essentially there's just a straight line that it just goes from one place to the next. This won't be in the video, but if we go to Google and just search interpolation, we might need to add animation or something like that in here. But actually you can see it. So it's just a mathematical concept that that's useful for animation. Let's actually see. Let's do. Oh wait, maybe this. Okay, let's add animation in here. We'll see some different results. Okay, this is a pretty good example.
Is that blur?
What?
No, that was a chibi that you just
Okay, we'll go back later and take a look at that. Okay, so let's look at, so this image shows different types of interpolation, and this basically just shows the change in value over time. So linear interpolation essentially means there's going to be a straight line. So it's just going to take the two keyframes and it's just going to do the same amount of change for each frame. So the one that we see right now, if we look at the position, we can see that the Y position changes and it's going basically the same amount each frame that we go. So it starts at 280, and if I go up by one frame, it goes 4 pixels, then it's kind of hard to move it one frame at a time. It goes to 12, 20, so it's actually going about 8 pixels per frame. And so linear interpolation means it just goes the same amount each time. And that's how we get this kind of boring, slow, smooth animation. Okay, so most of the time when we're doing an animation, we want there to be a little bit of a more interesting timing happen. And that's where interpolation can be really useful. So if I want to change the interpolation of these two keyframes, there's a few ways to do it. One way to do it just in the interface that we're currently in is I can right-click on the keyframe and I can go to Keyframe Interpolation. There's also a couple things like I can set the velocity. I can go to Keyframe Assistant to get it to do something quickly for me. But let's look at Keyframe Interpolation. That opens this little window over here, and it has two things. It has temporal interpolation and spatial interpolation. So spatial interpolation is a little bit easier to see. So let's look at that for a second, and then we'll come back to temporal interpolation, even though temporal is what we actually want to do. So spatial refers to like the space, obviously, like where it's moving in space. Temporal refers to time. So if I change this to Bezier, Bezier is just a term for the math that you use to calculate a curve between 2 points. So I'm going to change this to Bezier, and what you'll see is it adds this little anchor thing that when I drag, it's changing the curve. And so this is a spatial curve. So what we'll see is when the text comes in, it moves around that curve. So this is the curve in space, but what we ultimately want to do is look at the curve in time. But using the spatial one, we can kind of see how that works. It makes a curve, and the animation follows that curve. Let's bring the animation down just a little bit so we can see it the whole time. So I'm going to move this down here, and I'm going to move this down here, and just so we can see what it looks like the whole time we're going through that curve. Okay, so we see that, and so now I only have one keyframe that has that interpolation, the Bezier. So if I want to do it on the other one, I have to select the other one and go to Keyframe Interpolation. Spatial Interpolation is Bezier. Okay, so now I have both, so I can do a curve in and a curve out. So I get this kind of like snaking effect here. So that's kind of cool. It looks kind of nice, but what's actually more typical in animation is to have a temporal interpolation. So instead of moving our space in this curve, we're going to speed up and slow down time in a way that's going to feel more natural to physical movements in the real world. So I'm going to undo all these changes, and I am going to move this into frame a little bit so that we can see it the whole time. So I'm going to move this down here. So this will make it easier to visualize, and I'm going to fit in here. Okay. So now instead of spatial interpolation, I'm going to change this to temporal interpolation. So I'm going to change that to Bezier. I'm going to set the spatial back to linear. So this one is just affecting this keyframe here. And so we can see it's kind of speeding up. And then if we go over here, we can change the keyframe interpolation to Bezier. And it's kind of hard to see the difference. So we're going to look at a better way of visualizing this in a second. But if we just want to quickly add it, oh, it looks like it didn't add it over here. Bezier, okay. Okay, whatever. So it still looks kind of the same, but it's slowing down a little bit. There's also some presets in here. So another thing we can do is go to Keyframe Assistant and go to Ease Out. And so now this will be a little bit more clear what's going on. See, it sort of slows down at the end, so it kind of slows into place. But we can actually have a lot more control over these curves if we go into the graph editor. So this is a little bit more advanced, and you don't really need to do this to be able to create an effective animation, but it gives you a lot more control, and it also visualizes what's happening in a way that can be a lot more effective. I'm going to make this window a little bit bigger and make a little room over here as well. And so to go into the graph editor, I'm going to go back to the beginning here. I'm going to click on this button here. This is the graph editor. And that's going to change the view. So instead of just seeing the keyframes in terms of the time, we actually see how the value changes over time. So notice the X value is not changing. It's not moving left and right. What's changing is this green line, the Y value. So that's pretty much a linear interpolation there. If I select this keyframe, first of all, I'm going to have to, what you can see when I select the Y value, it also selects the X value. So if I don't want to do that, I have to turn on this separate X and Y button here. So that's one of the things that makes the graph editor a little trickier to use. You can see there's this very, very subtle curve over here that we added. I can use these buttons to kind of focus this in, although I probably want to see a little bit more this way. Okay, so I can take one of these keyframes and I can play with this curve by dragging out this Bezier handle. So now this will be a lot more dramatic. Okay, so see how it starts to fall faster? So what we're seeing on this line is the relationship between the animation and time. Okay, so if the line is very shallow, if it's not changing a lot, that means the animation is going slowly. When the line starts to increase in slope, that means the animation is going faster. And so we can have much more fine-tuned control over the speed of the animation using this graph editor. So this is called easing in. Easing in means the beginning is slow and then it gets faster as it goes out. Easing out means it starts fast and then gets slow. You can also combine them together. So I can take this one over here. If I want this to be a Bezier curve, I can add a handle right here. And if I drag this out farther, it's going to make this even more extreme. But if I go the other direction, I'm gonna have it faster at the beginning and then slow in the middle, and then it's going to speed up at the end. And so the more extreme we make this, the more sort of there's a point at which it goes from linear is like very sort of like mechanical and digital computer kind of looking. It's not very realistic. If we add a lot of curve to it, it starts to look a little more natural. But then there's a point at which if I really exaggerate this, it starts to look kind of digital again. It doesn't look, realistic. And you can see if I really exaggerate this, it actually goes back up a little bit. The curve kind of dips in and then goes back up. So if you want to add more effects, you can get kind of more interesting points. I can go here and add a keyframe here. If I want to do that, I can add a keyframe here, and then I can do some other crazy stuff. Like I can bend it around like this. This is not gonna, well, actually, it's kind of cool. I don't know. I could do a couple like weird bounces. I could go here. I'm using the regular keyframe thing to add another keyframe, but it's just on the Y. Although it's adding it on both. That's fine. Let's do another one of these. So we can have like a couple little bounces of the text. So I can do a lot more editing and create some cool effects by using the graph editor. So there are, it's a little trickier. There's more things to click on. I have to click on these Bezier curves and drag them around. I have to click on these keyframes. And it is honestly quite easy to click on the wrong keyframe. Like I might click on the X keyframe and suddenly I'm doing something I don't want to do. So you do have to be a little bit careful, but you can get some really cool effects using the graph editor. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to show with that. There's a lot more detail that we could go into with this, but I think this is sufficient for a little intro. If I want to go back to the regular view, I just turn the graph editor off. Notice that my keyframes have kind of changed shape. So I have these different types of keyframes now. One more thing actually I want to go over is a hold keyframe. Let's use a different animation for this. Maybe I'll go back to my background. So I'm going to lock my text. And my background kind of fades in here. But actually, I don't know if the background will be the best way to show this. Let's just bring back one of our stars. So let's go to star 1. Let's bring this back in. Actually, that's not going to be because it's rotating. Well, actually, that'll be kind of interesting. Okay, one last thing I want to show is the hold interpolation. And this basically means instead of smoothly transitioning from one value to the next, it just switches from one value to the next on the frame of the keyframe. So I'm going to do that with star number 1. I'm going to hit P to open the position. And what we're going to see is I can add a keyframe. If I click on this keyframe and go to interpolation and I go to hold and click OK, it's going to turn into like a little square. And so now it doesn't actually animate. It's still rotating, but it doesn't actually go anywhere. So what I would need to do is add some more keyframes. So I could go up here, add a keyframe, go here. Oh, whoops. Let's leave this as linear for a second. Uh-oh, where'd my... Okay, I'm gonna hit Control Z a couple times and hopefully get that back. Oh, now I'm undoing my text. Okay, what happened to my star? Okay, that's weird. Where'd it go? Did I turn the... Oh, I turned it off. Okay. Alright, there's my star. So what I could do if I want to do the hold interpolation is I could add a few more keyframes along the way. And I would probably... I might even add... First of all, I would probably want to do this at like an even number. I'm just kind of like randomly adding them in. But I'm going to add a whole bunch of keyframes. And then what I'm going to do is select them and change them all to hold interpolation. Okay, normally I can go like, there we go. Okay, so that I'll take all of those guys and go to Keyframe Interpolation and go to hold. Okay, so now it's just going to jump to those different parts. And so the more keyframes I add, the closer I get to the original animation. But if I think, let's zoom in on this a little bit. So it's still rotating in a smooth way, but notice that it's jumping from space to space. So hold interpolation just saves that value, but it jumps to that value. It doesn't smoothly transition to that value. So if I take some of these keyframes out, maybe that was too many. It's just going to jump across. And maybe we want to move it off screen here. Okay. Anyway, so that's hold interpolation. So those are our three basic types. We have the linear interpolation, which is like the smooth one. We have Bezier or ease in, ease out interpolation, which gives us kind of a curve. And then we have hold interpolation, which just holds one value for however long we want it to hold. All right, so let's go ahead and just export this. Obviously, you know, I would want to do a little more work on this to make it look a little better, but for now, I just want to export what I've got. So a couple of things I'm going to do first. I didn't really fill up my 10 seconds of animation. So one thing that can be really useful in After Effects, I'm going to put this at like 8 seconds. Our composition has like a, you know, a set duration. But if I want to set the composition just to this work area, I can right click on here and say trim comp to work area. And so now my composition is just the 8 seconds that I have animated. And so now when I export, I'm just going to get that 8 seconds. Okay, so now I'm going to save this, and now I just want to render this out and post it on the OpenLab. So I'm going to go to File and Export, and I'll go to, I'm going to have to, well, actually, okay, so there's a couple of options here. So if I add it to the regular After Effects render queue, I'm kind of limited in terms of what types of videos I can make. I can only make MOV files. Since I'm uploading it to YouTube, that actually doesn't really matter that much, because whatever I give YouTube, it's going to run its own compression on it. So giving it a high quality file is fine. The one thing is it takes a little while, but my animation is so short that it's really not going to take that long to render. If you want to do other file types or more sort of like sophisticated specific renders, you can use the Adobe Media Encoder. This has a lot more options. But for what we're doing right now, it's not really necessary. So I'm just going to add to the render queue in After Effects. And I just have to set a couple things here. So for output, I need to set where I want it to go. So I'm going to click on there. And I'm going to name this like title.mp4. Oh, I guess it does let me do an MP4. That's interesting. And I can look at the render settings. As I mentioned, I don't have as many options here as I would in the media encoder, but we can, you know, change some of these render settings if we want to. For the most part, they should be fine. And then you can change the format. So if you want to do like a higher quality format, you could use QuickTime. H.264 is more for like the web or something like that. So it'll be a smaller file size, but lower quality. But for this, H.264 is fine. It'll be fast. And so I'll hit OK here. And so once I have this, I just click render. And it's pretty short, so it's not going to take very long. As your animation gets longer, you see that when you add more like effects and stuff, your render time will get a lot longer. Sometimes rendering takes like hours or days, depending on the complexity of the animation.
Especially Blender renders.
Especially, yeah.
If you're animating